morning. Bright and early on a Friday. Yeah, it's so great to see people who are so committed to being here as often as possible to connect with other creatives, people who value creativity. Because that's really important. The things that we commit to have this way of becoming a big part of who we are. And that speaks to the power of ritual. Now, I have a master's degree in applied linguistics, and I'm also neurodivergent. So when I think about words like ritual, it can be a little terrifying, but it can also be profoundly grounding, right? So I want to talk about how ritual can show up in our creative lives using my own life experience as a bit of a conduit of sorts. Right? Sound good? Yeah. Yay! All right. Ritual can show up as tradition. Meet baby Leslie Crudup Villagarcia. This is me with my cousin Santos in a tiny little Peruvian village about a 3-hour drive outside of Cusco. Right? That's my mom and dad, epic human beings. They met when my dad was in Peru on business. My sister was born in Cusco, and then at some point, they ended up in Houston, Texas, where they spat out this lady. All right? And one thing that, this is kind of my message to all the hashtag wellness gurus out there and some of the new age spiritualists who don't seem to understand this. Peru is more than just an aesthetic. Yeah. The traditions that I grew up with descended from the same rituals and cultural practices that sustained ancient civilizations. The indigenous people who had to survive through colonization and everything that came with that. And then in the 80s and 90s, when this little one was ricocheting around the place, terrorism from groups like Sendero Luminoso or The Shining Path. And my sister and I are both Peruvian citizens and US citizens. We were taken back and forth between the US and Peru year after year for the next decade and a half or so. And because we had dual citizenship and our uncle was head of the terrorist task force in the Peruvian military, that made us constant targets for ransom kidnappings. Yeah, so it took me a long time to understand why we kept going back there. Every 3-month summer vacation, our ritual of completing the school year, flying to Peru, and then flying back in time to start the next school year, like why we kept doing that if it was so risky for us. But when I got older, I came to understand that that ritual was the best way for us to connect to our culture, to places like this. My auntie's ceramics factory in Cusco that sends this motif, pottery and jewelry, all over the world. And places like this. My grandfather's workshop, which to this day is still exactly how he left it before he died in 1999. Our truth was that our cultural connections were stronger than our fear. My dad, another epic human being, is from Oakland, California, where he was a member of the first original chapter of the Black Panther Party. And I love these pictures, because here we've got Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, and more importantly, Bobby Seale and Byron flippin' Crudup! That's my dad! I love it! So much! And here is Byron again, many years later, with Auntie Michelle. She doesn't know I call her that. Working on the Obama campaign in 2012. And I show these images not just because I love them, but also to illustrate that I grew up in a household where we didn't run from fear. I was raised to understand that when we saw an injustice, when we saw something happening in our community that we knew was wrong, staying silent and doing nothing was simply not an option. I grew up valuing showing up and photography, but I'll get into that part later. Ritual can show up as commitment. Every Saturday morning for the last 5 years or so, except during lockdown, and if I'm out of town or something, I drag my dirty, sticky bubble rig out to the West End markets, sometimes to some other places as well, and I make giant bubbles. And when I did this the first time, it was actually an attempt to escape this really deep, dark depression that I was in, thanks to the scourge of premenstrual dysphoric disorder, or PMDD. My PMDD was trying to kill me again. Not fun. And so I took my bubbles out to the markets because I was like, I desperately need to generate joy somewhere. And it worked. Kind of. Because at the same time, that first time is when I really understood that I was in serious trouble, mental health-wise. Because I was surrounded by these kids and families and these smiling faces, everyone having fun, running around, chasing bubbles, popping them, and making bubbles with me. And I couldn't connect. I had all these smiles around me, and I couldn't relate to smiling faces. So I went back on my medication. I went back to therapy, and I kept making bubbles, because I knew that something magical was happening in that moment. So now, even on Saturday mornings, where I wake up and I'm just like, oh, I don't want to do this, I'm tired, I want to just stay in bed. It's like I hear these little voices in my ear going, where's the bubble lady? Where's the bubble lady? And I'm like, no, I must go to them. I meant to do that. Because I think about all these disappointed kids, and I show up. I show up. Even when I don't want to. And that is the power of ritual. Now let's jump back in time again. I used to be a parkour instructor. Right? When I first moved to Melbourne, I had been living in Vietnam. And my first year in Melbourne, I was really depressed. I was extremely unfit. I needed stuff to do. And one day I waddled onto a it was a Sunday afternoon, first-timers class, and I was not good. I was not good. My mother would have described it as being as graceful as a dead elephant. Yeah. And I was like, what was I thinking? This is such a stupid idea. But I've got this philosophy in life that anything worth trying once is probably worth trying twice. So I tried it again the next week, and the week after. I got a little faster and a little stronger every time. And then a bunch of months later, I met this gorgeous human, Tony, my partner. And I have the full story on my YouTube channel. This, by the way, was before they came out as non-binary, which is why they're referred to as husband in that clip. After I met Tony, this was at a parkour gathering in Townsville, went back to Melbourne, broke up with the boyfriend I had at the time, and then I moved into the Trace facility, which was the warehouse where we did our indoor parkour training sessions. They also did a lot of stunt training there. It was just an incredible place to be. So what this brought for me was community. I kept showing up in this space where I initially just really did not fit in at all. But that didn't matter. I kept showing up. I found a life partner. Tony and I got married, first in Brisbane. I made that veil, by the way. That was before my whole purple thing kicked in. And then, in Peru, in a sunrise ceremony, which was modeled after an Inca ritual conducted by our family's shaman, Don Humberto Sonco, another epic human being. We were at the top of a really high mountain overlooking a cloud forest in the Amazon basin. There's a bonus shot of my veil. I just love it, it's so pretty. And then in 2016, Tony and I collaborated on our greatest masterpiece, our daughter, Qualia Luna Crudup Villagarcia, our rainbow baby. 5th time lucky. She's the one who stuck. Yeah. Very trying times. But now, how serious am I about showing up? This was a planning meeting for the national gathering that we were having here in Brisbane for the Australian Parkour Association. I was in active labor. I had the perfect excuse not to attend this meeting, but I wanted the event to go well, and I showed up, right? I'd had the epidural. We were just waiting at that point. I was kind of bored. And I was like, I've got my computer. Pop it open. Hi. Freaked everyone out. It was great. This was also, I like to think of it as my daughter's first real lesson in commitment. Qualia and I, as she got older, we got really into crafting and doing all that sort of thing. We, at some point, got really involved in the earth arts community at Northeast Street City Farm. We were making a lot of things out of clay and other natural materials. And this was a playgroup that my friend Bob started over 20 years ago, completely voluntarily. And that has become an important community ritual. Those are some of the little quirky creations that I made sitting on my bookshelf in my office. It was me leading one of the clay making sessions at some stage. This was a very important ritual for me and my daughter, and for everyone who came along to these sessions with us. And we kept it going. And then, this happened. 2020! Yeah, that was a wild time. Old rituals gave way to new rituals. Everyone was reflecting, thinking about life, thinking about what really mattered. One of the things that I was reflecting on a lot was my photography, this passion that I had inherited from my dad and my granddad. And of course, during lockdown and for the early years of motherhood, most of my pictures were of my kid. I grew up with the darkroom. And this is the darkroom that I set up when I was living in New York City, my last year in New York. It flooded constantly, but I loved it. And as I was diving into the history of my photography, I was thinking about my darkroom. And when I left the US in 2007, when I defected, I couldn't take all this stuff with me, so I really leaned even more into the digital side of photography and design. And these are just a couple of images from an exhibition that I had in Saigon in 2008, I believe it was, where I was kind of juxtaposing faces of people I knew with some of the textures from the local area. And that was an exploration that I enjoyed for years. And then, this happened. The first Black Lives Matter rally here in Brisbane. I was really angry that day. Partly because I'm shouting into this microphone to a sea of people, over 30,000 people. Some reports said like 50,000 plus, and it was like I could tell in my gut, looking at these faces, who was there for the movement and who was just there for the moment. Like who was gonna completely disappear as soon as we stopped trending. So then, for the next rally, I brought out this guy. I don't have great upper arm strength, so it is quite heavy. Yeah, my Big Ma, my 50 to 500, only because I couldn't find my portrait lens that day. The normal portrait lens that I would have used for that kind of occasion. But now it's the only lens I use. Because at that time, it allowed me to get these great close-up shots of people like these guys. The KP-120. This is a group of 120 refugees who were moved from offshore detention facilities into a hotel in Kangaroo Point to get medical treatment. And then they became prisoners in this hotel for over 2 years. And Kangaroo Point is not far from here. And some of you are probably hearing about this for the first time. But to me, these men embody the power of ritual. Because in 2020, when their restrictions were being tightened even further, they started a ritual of standing out on their balconies with signs that they made from whatever they had lying around to protest their treatment in a much more visible way. Eventually, a blockade was formed by some local activists. These are just a few of the many blockaders who were there, in order to prevent them from being transported from the hotel to a higher security facility near the airport. They wanted to hide these men away even further. But the activists who were there did not let that happen. These men have stories. They have histories. They have individual identities. Men like this guy, Saif, who thankfully is now happily settled in Minnesota with his family, who he was separated from, even though they were living in Brisbane in the community, his wife and his child. His story has been brilliantly detailed in an upcoming documentary called Let Them Hug by my friend Gemma, who couldn't be here today because she got COVID. But the trailer is on the Instagram. Watch it, it is incredible. Since then, I have photographed a lot of protests for various causes, long-standing social justice movements, primarily for the purpose of showing more people who was actually on the ground at these protests. It's not one pesky, monolithic, raggedy protester who just wants to stop traffic. These are people from all walks of life, all races, all ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds. People who have committed themselves to fighting and showing up for causes that they believe in. The kinds of things that don't get reported on properly in the Murdoch press. These are by my friend Kat Ross, who always takes my favorite pictures of me in action. My photography comrades mean a whole lot to me as well. I was in Pennsylvania visiting my family when Roe versus Wade fell. And unlike in Australia, when you're in the US and you're out in these big crowds saying a lot of things that people don't like, you can actually get shot. And if that sounds a little overdramatic, just 1 week after these pictures were taken, 2 blocks from where this picture was taken, there was a mass shooting at a fireworks display. But to me, that lent this whole extra level of bravery to the people who did commit themselves to showing up and hitting the streets week after week in protest of this decision. People like my mom. She came with me to one, which was really, really special for me. Most of the time, the people in my pictures don't know they're being photographed. So then what does show up are these moments of raw authenticity, of people experiencing all these different emotions in the face of fighting for causes that they believe in. And that funnels down into the work that I do in my business. I help people learn how to show up better for themselves, for their creative selves, for their communities. And anyone who's run a business knows that it's one of the most intense creative processes there is. One thing that makes it so intense for me as a life coach is that I'm constantly fighting back against a lot of things that are happening in the coaching industry that continue to do harm to marginalized communities. There's a lot of toxic positivity, but that's just the tip of a very big iceberg, which I do explore a lot in my podcast, Thriving Between the Lines, the podcast that examines personal development books through the lens of intersectionality. So in each episode, my co-host and I, we dive into a different personal development book, and we pick it apart. We look at the things that could work with some serious adjustments for people who don't have the same level of privilege as a lot of the people who dominate the hashtag success culture. And we also call out the stuff that's just incredibly dangerous and needs to go away. And we're on all the platforms. And I've been told we're hilarious, so you should definitely check it out. And I'm not against personal development books. I know a lot about these books. I've been running a personal development book club for over 3 years. Yeah. We meet at my office, which is just down the road over there, and we meet online. December will be our final meeting here in Brisbane because in January, I'm bundling up Tony and Qualia, and we are moving to Vietnam for various reasons. So until then, to engage further in all of the things that this lady's up to, we can talk. I'm also the vice president of the Pride Business Network, supporting LGBTQIA+ professionals and business owners in various ways. One of the things that we've got coming up is the New Farm Queer Film Festival at New Farm Cinemas. I'm really happy to be one of the organizers for this festival, and I will be posting updates about this on my Instagram, so if you aren't following me already, definitely do that. And finally, on the 21st of September at Pride Fair Day, I am hosting an open Q&A about polyamory and open relationships. So if you're gonna be there, come to the adult tent and ask me anything. All right. So my wish for us all is that when we leave here today, we can continue to embrace the power of ritual and how it can show up in our personal lives and in everything that we create to help create the lives and the communities that we want to see in the world. Thank you.